Everyone in the neighborhood had a word for him: broken. The dog lay near the edge of an empty lot, one leg twisted from an old injury, his body stiff from nights spent in the cold. People passed by quickly. Some looked away. Others whispered that he was beyond help. One afternoon, Daniel, a quiet man carrying his own invisible wounds, stopped across the street. He didn't come with food, a leash, or a plan. He simply sat down on the curb a few feet away. He didn't force eye contact. He didn't reach out. He just stayed. Minutes passed, then more. The dog slowly lifted his head, expecting rejection, but finding none. Daniel met his gaze and didn't turn away. In that moment, something shifted. Not the injury, not the past, but the certainty of being unwanted. The world had decided the dog was broken, but presence rewrote that sentence. The empty lot sat wedged between two apartment buildings on the east side of town, where the pavement cracked like old skin and the streetlights flickered more than they shone. It was the kind of place people passed through without noticing, a forgotten corner of a city that had long since moved on to brighter blocks and cleaner streets. But in the far corner, near a rusted chain-link fence, there was a presence that refused to disappear. The dog had no name, no collar, no story that anyone cared to learn. He lay in the same spot every day, his body curled into itself as if trying to take up as little space as possible. His coat was a patchwork of matted fur and bare skin, streaked with dirt and old scars. But it was his leg that people noticed first, the left hind leg that bent at an unnatural angle, twisted inward from some long-ago injury that had never healed properly. It gave him a lurching, uneven gait on the rare occasions he moved, a visible proof of suffering that made people uncomfortable. They called him broken. The words spread quietly through the neighborhood, passed along in hushed conversations at the corner store and over fences between backyards. Broken, as if the injury had defined him entirely, as if there was nothing left worth saving. Most people crossed the street when they saw him. Others quickened their pace, eyes fixed straight ahead, unwilling to acknowledge what lay just beyond their peripheral vision. A few stopped long enough to shake their heads, murmuring that someone should do something, though they never specified what that something might be. Animal control had been called twice. Both times they came, looked, and left. The dog wasn't aggressive. He wasn't a threat. He was just there, existing in a space the world had decided wasn't meant for him. On a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, when the air carried the first real bite of winter and the sky hung low and grey, Daniel walked past the lot for the first time in weeks. He'd been avoiding this route, taking the long way home from the bus stop, even though it added 15 minutes to his commute. But today, exhausted and distracted, he'd let habit guide his feet, and now here he was, standing at the edge of the cracked sidewalk, staring at the dog lying motionless in the dirt. Daniel was 34, though his face carried the weariness of someone much older. He worked nights at a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, loading and unloading trucks in a rhythm so monotonous that his mind often wandered to places he wished it wouldn't. He lived alone in a studio apartment 6 blocks away, a space so small and spare it felt more like a waiting room than a home. He didn't talk much, didn't have friends who called or family who visited. He moved through the world like a shadow, present but unnoticed, always careful not to take up too much space. He'd been that way since the accident 3 years ago, the one that took his younger sister, the one that left him with a guilt so heavy it had become a second skeleton inside him, holding him upright even as it crushed him from within. People had told him it wasn't his fault, that he couldn't have known, that he'd done everything he could. But their words slid off him like rain on glass, unable to penetrate the armor of self-blame he'd built around himself. Now, standing across the street from the empty lot, Daniel felt something stir in his chest. Not pity exactly, not sympathy. It was something quieter and more uncomfortable, a recognition he didn't want to name. He looked at the dog. The dog didn't look back. Its eyes were half closed, its breathing shallow and steady. It had learned, Daniel thought, not to expect anything from the world. Not kindness, not cruelty, just indifference. Daniel's first instinct was to keep walking, to let the moment pass and forget he'd ever stopped. But his legs didn't move. Instead, he found himself crossing the street, his feet carrying him to the opposite curb, where he lowered himself onto the concrete and sat down. He didn't approach the dog, didn't call out or make any gesture of invitation. He simply sat, his back against a utility pole, his hands resting loosely on his knees. The distance between them was maybe 20 feet, close enough to be present, far enough not to intrude. Minutes passed. The city noise hummed around them, distant traffic. A siren blocks away, the rattle of a shopping cart being pushed down the sidewalk. Daniel didn't move. The dog didn't either, though after a while its ears twitched slightly, acknowledging the presence of another living thing in its solitary world. Daniel had no plan, no reason for being there. He hadn't brought food or water. He didn't know what he was doing or why. He only knew that walking away felt impossible, that leaving the dog alone in that lot would be one more act of turning away from something that hurt to look at. And he'd spent 3 years turning away from pain. 3 years pretending he could outrun the weight of what he carried. The dog's eyes opened fully now, fixed on Daniel with a gaze that held no hope and no fear. Just a blank, exhausted awareness. Daniel met that gaze and held it. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He simply looked back, acknowledging what was there without trying to change it. Something passed between them in that moment, not understanding, not connection, but a shared recognition of survival, of still being here, even when the world had given them every reason not to be. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lot. Daniel stayed on the curb. The dog remained in the dirt, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Daniel felt the presence of something other than his own thoughts. When darkness finally settled over the street, Daniel rose stiffly, his legs cramped from sitting so long. He looked at the dog one more time, then turned and walked away. He didn't know if he'd come back. He didn't know if it mattered. But the next afternoon, when his shift ended and the bus dropped him at the corner, Daniel's feet carried him back to the empty lot. And once again, he sat down on the curb and waited. The days began to blur into a pattern. Daniel would finish his shift, ride the bus to the east side, and walk the 6 blocks to the empty lot. Each time, he'd sit on the same stretch of curb, his back against the same utility pole, his eyes trained on the same patch of dirt where the dog lay. He never approached, never tried to coax or call. He simply showed up and stayed. At first, the dog seemed indifferent to Daniel's presence. It would lie with its head resting on its front paws, eyes half closed, breathing shallow and rhythmic. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. The dog's ears would perk up when Daniel's footsteps approached. Its head would lift slightly, tracking his movements as he crossed the street and took his place on the curb. It never wagged its tail or made a sound, but the awareness was there, a flicker of recognition that someone had returned. Daniel noticed other things too. The way the dog's body tensed whenever someone else walked by, its muscles coiling as if preparing for a blow that never came. The way it flinched at sudden noises, a car door slamming, a child's shout, its entire frame shuddering before settling back into stillness. The way it dragged itself to a different corner of the lot when it rained, seeking the small overhang of a collapsed shed that offered minimal shelter. He began to understand that the dog's brokenness wasn't just physical. It carried wounds that couldn't be seen, scars etched into its psyche by a history Daniel could only imagine. Abandonment, neglect, perhaps cruelty. The dog had learned that humans were unpredictable at best, dangerous at worst, and it had adapted by expecting nothing. Daniel understood that lesson. He'd spent 3 years living by a similar code. After his sister's death, he'd withdrawn from everyone and everything, convinced that connection only led to loss. He'd stopped answering calls from old friends, stopped accepting invitations to dinners or gatherings. He'd built his life into something small and manageable, a routine so narrow it left no room for surprise or pain. But sitting on that curb, day after day, something in him began to crack. Not dramatically, not all at once, just small fissures in the armor he'd worn for so long. One afternoon, he brought a bottle of water and a plastic bowl he'd found at the dollar store. He didn't approach the dog with them. Instead, he set them down on the curb beside him and waited. The dog watched from its spot, its eyes tracking the objects, but making no move toward them. Daniel left the water there when he stood to leave, walking away without looking back. The next day, the bowl was empty, lying on its side in the dirt near the fence. Daniel refilled it and placed it in the same spot on the curb. This time, the dog's gaze lingered on him a moment longer before turning away. The neighborhood began to notice. Mrs. Chen, who ran the corner store, asked Daniel if he was the one feeding the stray. He nodded, unsure how to explain what he was actually doing. A teenager on a skateboard rolled past one evening and called out, "You know that dog's messed up, right?" Daniel didn't respond. A woman walking 2 small dogs on retractable leashes paused across the street, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and concern before shaking her head and continuing on. Daniel didn't care what they thought. He wasn't doing this for them. He wasn't even sure he was doing it for the dog. It was more like he was doing it for the act itself, the simple, stubborn refusal to turn away. As the weeks passed, the dog began to move closer, not dramatically, just inches at a time. One day, Daniel arrived to find the dog had shifted its resting spot to a patch of dirt nearer the fence, reducing the distance between them by a few feet. Another day, it was closer still. The water bowl, which Daniel now filled every visit, was gradually making its way from the curb toward the center of the lot, and the dog followed. Daniel started bringing food, cheap canned dog food from the store, the kind with gravy that pooled at the bottom of the bowl. He'd scoop it into a paper plate and set it down, always in the same spot, always without fanfare. The dog would wait until Daniel returned to the curb before approaching, its movements slow and cautious, its body low to the ground. It ate quickly, hunched over the plate as if expecting it to be snatched away at any moment. Daniel watched these small rituals unfold with a strange sense of purpose. He wasn't saving the dog. He knew that. The leg would never heal properly. The scars wouldn't fade. The fear woven into its bones wouldn't dissolve just because someone showed up with a can of food and a bottle of water. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was just this: showing up, being present, not looking away. One evening, as the temperature dropped and frost began to glitter on the cracked pavement, Daniel brought a blanket. It was an old fleece throw from his apartment, frayed at the edges and faded from too many washes. He folded it into a square and placed it near the fence, a few feet from where the dog usually slept. Then he returned to his spot on the curb and waited. The dog eyed the blanket with suspicion, sniffing the air but not approaching. Daniel stayed until the streetlights came on, then stood and walked away, leaving the blanket behind. The next afternoon, when he returned, the dog was lying on it, curled into a tight ball, its body nestled into the fabric, its breathing slow and steady. It looked up as Daniel approached, and for the first time, its tail gave a single tentative wag. Daniel froze. The gesture was so small, so fleeting, he almost thought he'd imagined it. But then it happened again, a slight movement. Barely more than a twitch, but unmistakable. He sat down on the curb, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. It wasn't joy, exactly. It wasn't relief. It was more like a loosening, a sense that something held too tightly for too long was finally beginning to let go. The dog watched him from the blanket, its eyes clearer now, more focused, and Daniel watched back. His own wounds reflected in the creature before him. Two broken things, learning slowly and painfully that presence could be enough. Winter arrived with a vengeance, bringing winds that cut through clothing and temperatures that dropped below freezing most nights. The empty lot became a harsher place, the dirt hardening into frozen ground, the scattered debris coated in ice. Daniel worried. He'd upgraded the blanket to a sleeping bag he'd bought second-hand, along with a cardboard box he'd reinforced with duct tape to create a makeshift shelter near the fence. The dog used both, retreating into the box when the wind picked up, emerging only to eat and drink. Daniel's visits became longer. He'd arrive earlier, sometimes bringing a thermos of coffee for himself, and stay until darkness forced him to leave. He'd watch the dog move around the lot, its limp more pronounced in the cold, its body stiff from the chill. He wanted to do more, to take the dog to a vet, to bring it inside somewhere warm, but he knew that trust couldn't be rushed. The dog had spent too long surviving alone to suddenly accept rescue. One Saturday morning, Daniel arrived to find the lot empty. The sleeping bag was there, the cardboard box, the water bowl frozen solid. But the dog was gone. Panic seized him, sharp and sudden. He stood in the street, scanning the area, calling out even though the dog had never responded to his voice before. He walked the perimeter of the lot, checked behind buildings, asked passers-by if they'd seen a limping dog with matted fur. No one had. He spent the entire day searching, retracing his steps, expanding his radius block by block. By evening, exhausted and heartsick, he returned to the lot and sat on the curb, his head in his hands. He told himself it was foolish to feel this way. The dog wasn't his. He'd never even touched it. But the absence felt like a wound reopening, like loss compounding loss. As darkness fell, Daniel heard a sound, a faint scraping against pavement. He looked up and saw the dog dragging itself back toward the lot, its injured leg trailing behind it, its body covered in fresh cuts and mud. It had been somewhere, done something, survived something, and now it had returned. Relief flooded through Daniel so intensely it made him dizzy. He wanted to run to the dog, to check its injuries, to scoop it up and carry it to safety, but he forced himself to stay still, to let the dog come to him on its own terms. The dog made its way to the cardboard box and collapsed inside, panting heavily. Daniel stood slowly and approached, stopping several feet away. He knelt down, making himself smaller, less threatening. The dog's eyes met his, and in them Daniel saw something he hadn't seen before. Acknowledgement, not just of his presence, but of his constancy. The dog had left and returned, and Daniel was still here. That night, Daniel broke his own rule. He moved closer, inching forward on his knees until he was just outside the entrance to the cardboard box. He extended his hand, palm up, and waited. The dog's eyes tracked the movement, its body tensing, but it didn't pull back, didn't growl or snap. It simply watched. Daniel kept his hand there, unmoving, barely breathing. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, the dog stretched its neck forward and sniffed his fingers. Its nose was cold and wet against his skin. Daniel felt tears prick his eyes, an overwhelming surge of emotion he couldn't contain. He didn't touch the dog, didn't move his hand to pet or stroke. He just let the dog take in his scent, let it confirm what it had already sensed, that this human was different, that this human stayed. After a moment, the dog pulled back and settled into the sleeping bag, its breathing evening out as exhaustion overtook it. Daniel withdrew his hand and returned to the curb, where he sat until well past midnight, keeping watch over the creature that had somehow become the center of his world. The incident marked a turning point. Over the following weeks, the dog allowed Daniel to come closer. It would eat from the paper plate while Daniel sat nearby, no longer waiting for him to retreat to the curb. It would rest its head on its paws and watch him with calm, steady eyes, the fear gradually draining away. Daniel began to notice details he'd missed before. The way the dog's ears perked up at the sound of birds. The way it would sniff the air when someone walked by with takeout food, its nose twitching with interest. The way it would sometimes stretch its front legs forward and arch its back. A brief moment of comfort in an otherwise painful existence. He also noticed the looks from the neighborhood. Some people had started to smile when they saw him, nodding in approval. Others still shook their heads, muttering about wasted effort. One man stopped to tell Daniel he was making a mistake, that the dog would turn on him eventually, that wild animals couldn't be trusted. Daniel listened politely and said nothing. He'd learned that some people couldn't understand why anyone would sit beside something broken and not look away. One cold afternoon, as Daniel sat on the curb with a cup of coffee warming his hands, the dog did something unexpected. It stood, limped across the frozen dirt, and sat down beside him. Not touching, but close enough that Daniel could feel the heat radiating from its body, close enough that if he reached out, he could rest his hand on its back. Daniel's breath caught. He set down his coffee and slowly, carefully, extended his hand. The dog stiffened slightly but didn't move away. Daniel's fingers made contact with matted fur, and he felt the dog's heartbeat beneath his palm, rapid and strong. They sat like that for nearly an hour, man and dog side by side on a cold curb in a forgotten corner of the city. Daniel didn't speak, didn't move except to breathe. He just let his hand rest there, a point of connection between two beings who had learned that presence could heal what medicine and time could not. When the sun dipped below the buildings and shadows stretched across the lot, the dog stood and limped back to its shelter. Daniel watched it go, his hand still tingling from the contact, his chest full of something that felt dangerously close to hope. He knew the road ahead would be long. The dog would need veterinary care, socialization, a real home. And Daniel would need to face his own demons. To accept that choosing to care for something didn't guarantee he could protect it from harm. But for now, in this moment, it was enough to know that neither of them was alone. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, as if unsure it was welcome. The ice melted, leaving puddles in the cracked pavement. The days grew longer, the wind lost its edge, and in the empty lot, beneath the shelter of cardboard and duct tape, the dog waited. Daniel had made a decision. He'd spent weeks researching, calling shelters and rescue organizations, trying to find someone who could help. Most places were full, their resources stretched thin. Others took one look at the dog's injury and age and shook their heads, explaining gently that medical treatment would be expensive and adoption unlikely. The phrase quality of life came up more than once, a euphemism Daniel recognized immediately. He refused to accept it, not after everything they'd been through, not after the dog had finally learned to trust. He found a vet willing to do a consultation at a reduced rate, a woman named Dr. Ramirez, who ran a small clinic on the south side. Daniel had to borrow money to cover even the discounted cost, asking for an advance at work and skipping meals to stretch his paycheck. But he didn't hesitate. Getting the dog to the clinic was another challenge entirely. Daniel couldn't just pick it up and carry it. The trust between them was still fragile, built on months of patience and restraint. Instead, he spent days coaxing the dog closer, using food and gentle words, until finally one morning he was able to slip a makeshift leash around its neck. The dog tensed, pulling back instinctively, but Daniel held firm, speaking in low, steady tones until the resistance faded. The walk to the bus stop was slow and difficult. The dog limped alongside him, its body stiff with anxiety, its eyes darting to every passerby. People stared. Some crossed the street, others whispered behind their hands. Daniel ignored them all, his focus entirely on the creature at his side. At the clinic, Dr. Ramirez was professional but kind. She examined the dog thoroughly, noting the old fracture that had healed incorrectly, the malnutrition, the scars that covered its body. She ran her hands over its frame and spoke softly, explaining options and outcomes. The leg could be treated with surgery, but it would be expensive and painful, and the dog was older, maybe 8 or 9 years, and the recovery would be long. Alternatively, the dog could live with the injury as it was, managing pain with medication and limited mobility. Daniel listened, his jaw tight. He asked about cost, about prognosis, about what the dog's life might look like either way. Dr. Ramirez answered each question with care, never pushing him toward a decision, never making him feel like he was failing. In the end, Daniel chose management over surgery, not because he didn't want to help, but because he understood something crucial. The dog had survived this long on its own terms. It had adapted, endured, built a life around its limitations. Another trauma, another violation of its body might break something that couldn't be repaired. Dr. Ramirez prescribed pain medication and provided instructions for care. She also did something unexpected. She waived part of her fee, telling Daniel that what he'd done for this dog mattered, that most people would have walked away, and that sometimes presence was the most powerful medicine of all. Daniel took the dog back to the lot that evening, his arms aching from supporting its weight on and off the bus, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he couldn't fix everything. But as he watched the dog settle back into its sleeping bag, he realized something profound. He wasn't supposed to fix everything. He was supposed to show up, to stay, to bear witness to suffering without turning away. Over the following months, Daniel continued his routine. He visited every day, bringing food and water and medication. He sat on the curb and watched the dog navigate its small world with increasing confidence. And slowly, gradually, he began to apply the same patience to himself. He started seeing a counselor, a decision he'd avoided for 3 years, convinced that talking wouldn't change what had happened. But sitting in that office, speaking the words he'd kept locked inside, he felt the same small shifts he'd witnessed in the dog. Not healing exactly, but softening, a willingness to let someone else see the broken parts without immediately pushing them away. He thought about his sister often, about the accident, about the guilt he'd carried like a stone in his chest, and he realized that she wouldn't have wanted this. Wouldn't have wanted him to spend his life punishing himself for something he couldn't have prevented. She would have wanted him to live, to connect, to find meaning, even in pain. The dog taught him that, not through words or wisdom, but through its simple, stubborn refusal to disappear. It had been written off, labeled broken, deemed unworthy of effort, and yet it persisted. It survived. And when someone finally sat down beside it and didn't look away, it learned that survival could become something more. One afternoon in late spring, Daniel arrived at the lot to find a woman standing near the fence, taking photographs of the dog. She introduced herself as a volunteer with a rescue organization that specialized in senior and special needs animals. She'd heard about Daniel and the dog from Dr. Ramirez, who'd reached out on his behalf without telling him. The organization had a foster home available, a quiet place with a fenced yard and experienced caretakers who understood trauma. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He'd known this moment might come. Part of him had even hoped for it. But now, faced with the reality of letting go, he felt the old fear rising. What if he couldn't do it? What if the dog saw this as another abandonment? He sat down on the curb, his hands shaking. The dog limped over and pressed its body against his leg, its warmth grounding him. Daniel closed his eyes and felt tears slide down his face, not from sadness, but from something deeper. Relief, gratitude, the profound, aching awareness that he had done something that mattered. He told the woman yes. Not immediately, but after sitting with the dog for a long time, letting himself feel the weight of what he was choosing. The dog would go to the foster home. It would have medical care, regular meals, a warm place to sleep, and Daniel would visit as often as allowed, because this connection wasn't ending, it was just changing shape. The day they took the dog away, Daniel stood in the empty lot and looked at the space where it had lived for so long. The cardboard box was gone, the sleeping bag, the water bowl, all of it packed up and transported to a new life. But the lot didn't feel empty. It felt full of everything that had happened there, every moment of patience and presence, every small victory and quiet surrender. Daniel walked home slowly, his hands in his pockets, his mind turning over the past months. He thought about the word broken and how carelessly people used it, how they applied it to things and beings that didn't fit their idea of wholeness, as if damage was the end of value. He thought about the dog, limping through the world with its twisted leg and scarred body, and how it had shown him that survival was its own kind of grace. He thought about himself, about the guilt he still carried, the grief that would never fully leave, about how he'd spent 3 years believing he was too damaged to connect, too far gone to matter, and he realized that he'd been wrong, not because he'd healed, he hadn't, not completely, but because healing wasn't the prerequisite for worth. Showing up was enough, staying was enough, refusing to look away was enough. The neighborhood moved on, as neighborhoods do. The empty lot was eventually sold and cleared, turned into something new and unremarkable. People forgot about the dog that had lived there, the man who'd sat beside it, the small miracle of attention that had unfolded over months of cold curbs and patient waiting. But Daniel didn't forget. He visited the foster home every week, sitting in the yard while the dog dozed in the sun. Its body relaxed in a way it had never been on the street. He brought treats and toys, though the dog was more interested in simply being near him, its presence a quiet reminder of what they'd built together. And late at night, when Daniel sat alone in his apartment, he thought about the moment that had changed everything, the afternoon he'd stopped across the street and chosen not to walk away. He thought about how easy it would have been to keep going, to let the dog fade into the background of a life lived in careful isolation. And he thought about how different everything was because he'd made a different choice. The world still had a word for broken things, but Daniel had learned a new language, one where presence spoke louder than labels, where patience could rebuild what cruelty had destroyed, where two wounded beings could sit beside each other and discover that they were never beyond repair. They were just waiting for someone to stay. If this story moved you, there are countless others like it waiting to be told. Subscribe to Beyond the Instinct and join us as we explore the profound connections that remind us what it means to be human and what it means to truly see another soul. Thank you for being here.